it with the business down the road. The police have assured me that we will not be moved. So well done for getting here. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to plug the talks that are going on at Blackfriars currently on Tuesdays. Sadly, I missed the first one on Tuesday, but I hope to go to the others. They are absolutely stunningly. I mean, it's an amazing set of speeches. Not speeches. They're discussions about difficult doctrines. There's even one about women in the church. So I do urge you to keep an eye on these and go. They're at 8 o'clock on Tuesday evenings at Blackfriars. So the candles is one, and that's another poster which you might see around the place. Anyhow, I wouldn't be surprised if there are some theology students present, because our talk today is about probably one of the greatest doctors of the Church of all time, Thomas Aquinas. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Father Peter Hunter, who is a philosopher and a theologian, and I'm sure is going to elucidate the mysteries of Thomism. Welcome.
So I've been asked to say just a little bit about myself first. I'm South African by nationality. I grew up there and got into political trouble and had to leave the country quite sharpish to avoid prison for refusing to fight in the South African army. Ended up in England and read maths at Cambridge, and then met the Dominicans there. And at the same time as I was sort of falling out of the love with the idea that I might end up a great professor of mathematics, I fell in love with the idea of being a Dominican and preaching God's truth. And in particular, I had a great passion from those, starting in those years, I suppose, but even earlier, in philosophy. So when I entered the order, it was quite natural for me to drift into teaching philosophy, which is what I now do. So I teach mostly logic and metaphysics down at the Priory at Blackfriars. So that's who I am. But one of the things I do that takes me out of the house, I think it's important if you're a friar academic, not to just be a friar academic. And so on the weekends I go out to a youth retreat centre at a place called Kintbury near Newbury, out in Berkshire, and I celebrate Mass for groups of young people, 15 to 18-year-olds mostly, who come on retreat there. And on one of these retreats, one of the young people asked me, what's the most important philosophical idea that you know? Goodness. So I went for the following one, ens et bonum convertuntur, which, if your Latin isn't up to speed, says very roughly that if you talk about being and you talk about goodness, deep down you're talking about the same thing. And if that sounds like a tremendously abstract concept, I suppose it is, but it actually has lots of very practical applications. So one of the consequences, immediate consequences, is being admits of degrees, as goodness does. So people can be good and they can be better, they can be miserable. Well, people can exist. Some people exist more vividly than other people. It's a very interesting idea. Or to put it even more practically, in the human case, existing is just being alive. And so what we're saying is, the better you live your life, the more alive you will be. It's a very interesting idea. So we can, most of us, we live our lives at a fairly low pitch, and we don't go in for the great moral adventures of life most of the time. We shy away from them. But if we did, that would be to be more alive, more human than we are. And I think this is one very characteristic Thomist idea, that we tend to think of human beings as flawed. Well, that's because our experience of human beings is mostly of flawed human beings. But the idea of human being isn't inherently about something flawed. And here, Thomas is taking his lead from St. Paul, where St. Paul says that our humanity is measured by the humanity of Christ. So, Jesus as the perfectly human being, the first perfectly human being, and then us as striving to be human. And that idea that humanity, being human, is a project is something that you do see all over the place, but I think it is something that's very distinctively Thomist. So G.K. Chesterton very famously said, you know, with other animals, they just are what they are. It wouldn't make sense at all to clap a cat on the back and say, be a cat. Cats just are cats, naturally. But you could clap somebody on the back and say, be a man. And that would make sense. Being a human being is a project, something that you can fail at or succeed at. So I think, I took that example partly because it starts with a very abstract idea. Being and goodness are convertible. What on earth does that mean? And actually, it turns out to have all sorts of practical ways of seeing ourselves in the world. And secondly, because I think it exhibits another very important Thomist idea in relation to spirituality, and that is, and this is something that we've become used to, things like CBT have picked up this idea, changing how we think about the world changes how we act and feel about the world. Feel about the world and act in it, feel about ourselves. So we sometimes think that feelings are pretty pre-rational, not irrational always, but pre-rational. We feel a certain way and then we react. But Aquinas thought that was wrong. He thought that the way we felt about things followed on how we thought about them. So thinking comes first, or understanding the world comes first. And I think, at least partly, that must be true, right? I fear something because I see it as a threat. Or I am delighted by something because I see it as good for me in some way. Okay. So, the main focus of my talk, I wanted to make the idea that God is the ground of being. That's certainly the title on the poster, right? I thought that might put all of you off. I thought none of you turn up for a talk that called God the ground of being and wanted to make something spiritual out of it. But I think it's actually very often it's these fundamental ways in which we see ourselves and we see God and we see the world around us will actually change how we live our Christian life. So Aquinas is very famous for giving 5 arguments for the existence of God, and indeed, if you see pictures or statues of Aquinas, he's always like this, saying, well, the first way and the second way and so on, right? So he's always showing you that he's got 5 ways of showing that God exists. That's how he's always pictured. And in his third way, he gives an argument that's a bit like this. He says, most of the things around us, including ourselves, depend for our existence on other things. How do we know that? Well, because we come into existence and we go out of existence. We aren't the kind of things that you say, well, oh, human beings, well, they've got to exist. Well, there's nothing self-existent about a human being. Human beings might exist and they might not exist. And so, if you think about it, most of the things around us, in fact, all of the things we can think about, end up relying on their existence for something else. So Aquinas thinks there must be something, namely God, that exists of itself, but doesn't rely on being caused in existence by other things, but on the contrary causes existence. So if that was just gibberish to you, the punchline is the whole universe is, as it were, stands in need of a support, a reason to exist. And God is that reason. The whole universe stands in need of support, a reason to exist, and God is that reason it exists. Now, if you think of our relationship to God like that, I think it has profound effects on how you think about the role of God in your life, the place that God plays in your life. And I think it also changes radically how you ought to see yourself. So, I think in the modern world very often, one of the primary things we're aiming for is some sort of autonomy. But of course, if we rely in the most fundamental way possible at every moment of our lives for our existence on God, then autonomy doesn't look quite the same, right? We aren't able to stand on our own 2 feet because we wouldn't have feet to stand on if it weren't for the Creator. So I am actually talking about the relationship of creation. I'm talking about the way in which God holds us in being. And I think it's very notable that Aquinas didn't make a distinction between creation in the sense of setting it all going and creation in the sense of holding things in being. He thought all God did, as it were, was hold the universe in being at every moment. That's what creation means for Aquinas. It's God making everything to exist. Now, as I say, I've already given you one way in which that profoundly changes, I think, our whole way of seeing ourselves. And I want to spell that out a little bit more. So Christians traditionally have said creation is ex nihilo. That's the Latin tag. It means from nothing. And Aquinas has an absolutely brilliant analysis of the ex nihilo in one of his books. And he goes through all sorts of analyses of it, different ways of reading that one phrase. The one way, of course, we don't want to read it is creation is from nothing, as if nothing were some kind of material out of which the universe is made, right? You could make it out of steel, but now you've got it made out of nothing, right? It's not that sort of thing. He finally lands on the idea that saying creation is ex nihilo is just about saying, but for God, we would be nothing. Now that's, I think, a good way of underlining our absolutely radical dependence on God at every moment of our lives. It's something we're not always aware of course. But I think sometimes we do become aware of our dependence. You have that wonderful phrase in the scriptures of God holding us in the palm of his hand. And that, I think, makes sense to a lot of people in moments of great distress in their lives. So sometimes in moments when we really need God in other ways, we're perhaps aware all of a sudden of the radical way in which God is constantly holding us in his hand, loving us into existence. It's, of course, originally an Augustinian idea, but it fits very well with this view of creation. Augustine said, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. That's a very profound view of God. And I think it underlines the fact that, mainly through the kind of self-deception of which human beings seem to be particularly good at, we're all in a certain way alienated from ourselves, alienated from who we should be, existing as something less alive than we could be. And God is always calling us back to ourselves, calling us back to become ourselves. I think that's a very important part of what I'm saying. I think this idea of God closer to us than we are to ourselves, God on whom we depend at every moment of our being, also changes perhaps the way in which we pray. I think it's very tempting to have a view of prayer where prayer is a part of our lives. We pray and we eat and we chat with friends and we go on Facebook and we do a million different things, but prayer is one of those things. One of the key ideas of Dominican spirituality generally, so this is pre-Thomas, one of the key ideas of Dominican spirituality generally is, if you're going to be a religious but spend a good deal of your life on the road, as good Dominicans do, travelling around preaching the gospel, if you're going to spend a good bit of your life on the road, you've got to somehow take the cloister with you. And that's a very interesting idea, and I think it actually is very, very generally applicable to all of our Christian lives. If prayer is just the thing we do in church, or it's just the thing we do at the beginning and end of our days, or at those snatched moments when we're in the middle of things and we stop for a moment and say a quick prayer, if that's what our prayer amounts to, it's a part of our life. It doesn't suffuse our lives. And that's going to mean that God is only, for us, a part of our lives. When in fact the reality, of course, is God is everything. God makes us everything that we are. So the idea of taking the cloister with you was Dominic's way of responding to the scriptural command to pray constantly. And whereas we might be inclined to think of that as hyperbole, Dominic thought it was literally true. We should constantly be at prayer. Well, you can't constantly be at prayer if you're busy with other things, unless somehow the things that you're busy with are also prayers. And so the Dominican spirituality, from a very early time, there grew up this idea that we ought to make of every part of our lives, absolutely everything that we do, we ought to make every part of our lives a prayer. Now that, I think, fits again with this idea of God as the ground of our being, God causing us to exist, holding us in existence, because it says that God is constantly in our lives. I think sometimes we ask, can God, if you come right to the front, there's a bit of the bench right here that you could sit on. Not at all. So, if God is the cause of our entire existence, then his relationship to us must be very different than we sometimes think. We sometimes ask God to come into a situation, or we think of God as intervening in history. But that can't literally be true, can it? You can only intervene where you weren't already. You can only intervene by coming into a situation where you were previously absent. But God can't be absent. And in fact, Scripture tells us what happens when God is absent. You take back your spirit, they die, returning to the dust from which they came. So, God is always active, present to us, creating us, making us to be the people that we are. And that's a fundamental part of our human life. And it also means, of course, that we can find God in all sorts of things. Dominicans find God in study, and that's not a surprising thing. We find God in study because just as being and goodness are names of God, so is truth. So this is not a coincidence, right? Speaking truly is just saying of what is that it is. In other words, truth is absolutely dependent on being, existence. If you say of what is that it is, then you speak truly. That's just Aristotle. So, truth is always, well, caused by God. Truth is always, in a certain sense, God's truth. Beauty is another thing that follows on goodness, on being. So the beauty that we see in the world around us is the beauty of God, or a participation in the beauty of God, a share in the beauty of God, a creative share. And so I think when we see God as the ground of being, which, as I say, sounds like this abstract metaphysical idea, and it is in a certain way. In fact, it has a very practical application to our Christian lives. It makes God absolutely part of everything that we do, and it makes God absolutely a part of everything that we see and all the people that we interact with, the truth that we discover in our studies. Every part of human endeavour is suffused with the existence of God. I think it also helps us in another way, and this is, I think, a very important part of Aquinas, and I think at first it's very unsettling, but I think it's unsettling in a very good way. And that is, it's very hard for human beings to get away from thinking of God as a God with a small g. What do I mean by that? It's very hard for human beings to get away from thinking of God as, say, the top person in the universe, or, like me, only infinitely good and infinitely powerful and so on. I think a lot of people fall into that kind of mistake of making God like your next door neighbour, only more powerful. Infinitely so, of course. But God is radically different from us. If you think that all the things we see around us are dependent beings that exist because they depend on the existence of God, then God's existence must be very, very different from ours. Aquinas will say what God is just sheer existence. For us, what we are, our humanity, and that we are two things. I'm human, and I receive my existence from outside, and those are two quite different things. For God, what he is and that he is come together. God is, as it were, existence with a capital E. Now, something like that is not top person in the universe, and that makes it very hard to think about God properly. But it does mean we have to purify our idea of God. I think a lot of Dominicans talk about this in various different ways, a lot of Dominican spiritual writers, but a lot of Dominicans in general talk about... Sorry, are you...
There's a bomb in St Giles, and we've got to clear the whole building. So we've got to go north from here. The police want us to clear it now.
Oh!